Buenos días a todos. Muchas gracias por estar aquí. Vamos a comenzar con la conferencia magistral de hoy, que está a cargo de Dr. Derek Bielefeld, quien es licenciado en bioquímica y máster en Filosofía y Ciencias Políticas y Sociales por la Universidad de Cambridge. Además, es doctor en Filosofía y Teoría Social por la Universidad de West Anglia en Norwich, Inglaterra. Es Fellow of the Royal Society of Biology, Inglaterra. Es profesor titular de Derecho y Bioética y director del Centro de Ética y Derecho de las Ciencias de la Vida de Durham University, Reino Unido. Ha ostentado previamente posiciones en jurisprudencia, criminología y estudios sociojurídicos en la Universidad de Sheffield, Reino Unido, donde fue el director fundador del Instituto Sheffield de Biotecnología, Derecho y Ética, así como también ha sido profesor de criminología en la Universidad de Cambridge. Fue vicedirector del Comité de Ética de la Investigación de Centros de Investigación de la región de Trent entre 1997 y 2006. Sus publicaciones abordan y abarcan muchas áreas del derecho: la filosofía pura y aplicada y la criminología, incluyendo libros tales como The Dialectical Necessity of Morality, publicado por la Universidad de Chicago en 1991, también junto a Roger Brownsworth, Human Dignity in Bioethics and Biolaw, publicada por Oxford University Press en 2001, y Consent in the Law, publicado por Hart en el año 2007. Derek Bielefeld es también, podríamos decirlo, con justa razón, uno de los fundadores del bioderecho europeo, junto a Peter Kemp, Jacob Dahrendorf y Roger Brownsworth. Es una figura de primer orden mundial en nuestra disciplina. Entonces, Derek, you are very welcome here. Thank you very much for having accepted the invitation.
Well, thank you very much for having me here. It's actually a great honor, and I'm very, shall we say, pleased that South America is getting itself on the map, and it needs to continue. And I must apologize for the fact that I do not speak Spanish at all. So I will try. Some of my talk will be quite technical, but I will try not to go too fast, and you can ask questions about it afterwards, of course. Right. When we talk about, as it were, genetic manipulations, there are a number of prohibitions which are to be found in human rights documents. And there are just two in particular documents that I want to refer to. First is the UNESCO Universal Declaration on the Human Genome and Human Rights of 1997. And the second is the Council of Europe's Convention on Human Rights and Biomedicine of 1997, which is also known as the Oviedo Convention. And I'm just going to focus, these are just examples. But in the UNESCO Declaration, we have Article 5, any treatment affecting an individual's genome without informed consent, or where it is impossible, then not in the best interest, is prohibited. Presumably because it's contrary to human rights. And Article 11 prohibits reproductive cloning, basically on the grounds that it's contrary to human dignity. Article 12, which is quite interesting, says beneficial manipulations, which are those that relieve suffering and improve the health of the individual and humankind as a whole, must be made available to all. So it's contrary to, as it were, human dignity and human rights not to make beneficial manipulations available to all. Okay? Bear that in mind. In the Oviedo Convention, in Article 13, it prohibits any non-therapeutic manipulations and any germline modifications, whether these are therapeutic or not. Alarm bells ringing anywhere? Okay, I'll come back to that. The question I really want to address, the main question I want to address, is, are these prohibitions defensible within any legal framework that aims to implement the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations of 1948? That's my primary question. So I'm not going to be here, I will say something about it, but I'm not going to be looking at whether or not, as it were, there are human rights. I'm not going to be looking at whether or not there is such a thing as human dignity. What I'm going to be looking at really is if you are aiming to implement the UDHR 1948, what is the view of human dignity contained in, as it were, implied in, things which are said in that document? The idea being that since all of the United Nations conventions, like the ICCPR and ICESA and so on, the European Convention on Human Rights, the regional conventions, the American Convention, etc., all claim to give effect to the UDHR 1948. Okay. So the question is, what is human dignity? How is it related to human rights? How, in principle, can human dignity be violated? What ought to be recognized as human rights? Then I was going to talk a little bit about the relationship between the idea of the human genome and human dignity. And then I'll come back to what genomic manipulations are violations of either human dignity or human rights. And as I've said, I'm going to be examining these questions, not as it were de novo philosophically, although I'll say something about how you might, but how you should conceive of this for purposes related to law in any system that professes adherence to human rights in accordance with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR 1948. Now, what you find in the UDHR, and indeed in ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, indeed the American Convention on Human Rights in the preambles and so on, very clear statements to the effect that all human rights owe their existence to the possession of human dignity. That is the fundamental relationship between human rights and human dignity, which is to be found in the UDHR 1948. So, that people use human dignity in all sorts of senses. I'm not interested, okay? For the purposes of this paper, human dignity is that by virtue of which and which it's necessary to have in order to have human rights, because that is the conception of human dignity which is contained within the UDHR 1948. And if one wants to get philosophically technical about it, use Immanuel Kant's language, human dignity is the ratio essendi of all human rights, which means possessing human dignity is the necessary and sufficient ontological reason why human beings have human rights. It's something about their nature. To possess human being, when you have human dignity, you have something as a human being that gives you human rights. It's the reason why you have human rights. Okay, and this must be distinguished from what Kant would call the ratio cognoscendi, which is the reason how you know or why you know these things. Okay. So, of course, the million-dollar question then is, what is it about human beings that gives them human dignity? What is it about human beings that, as it were, makes them worthy of moral concern and respect? What is the property? Now, what we need to bear in mind here is that human rights prescribe what may or ought to be done. Okay, it's a normative category. According to Article 2 of UDHR, they are inalienable. You have them simply because you are a human being, or if you like, simply because you have human dignity. And human rights are possessed equally by all human beings. Article 1 UDHR. Now, I think it follows from this, and I'll explain why in a second, that human dignity, if you like, refers to what the property that human beings must possess in order to be agents. It does not refer to their biological existence as human beings. Cannot. And what I mean by an agent, right, is an intelligible addressee and addressor of any practical precepts. And a practical precept is something which specifies what may or ought to be done. So you can't talk about possessing human dignity if it makes no sense to say that you may or ought to do something, and if you are incapable of thinking and talking about what may or ought to be done. Why is that inherent in the UDHR? Okay? Well, rights can only exist in relation to those capable of having duties. Whenever there's a right, somebody's going to have duties, and it's the moment you say you have a right, somebody's got to have a duty, or something's got to have a duty to you. And that something must be an agent. And according to all of this stuff about equality, these beings who have these duties must also have rights. And these rights cannot be held equally with those who are incapable of having duties. If you have rights against me, I have duties to you. Okay? And if you have no duties to me, my rights cannot be equal to yours. Yours are superior to mine. That is just logic. Okay. Now, is this coherent? Why does this question arise as to, might this possibly not be coherent? Well, all human beings, biologically defined, don't seem to have the sorts of capacities by which you can actually say they have duties. Try telling an embryo that it's got a duty. Try telling a young child, 1-year-old, that it's got a duty, and see how far you get. Okay? But we must note that the UDHR actually says human beings are born with reason and conscience and owe duties. This leaves us with only two possibilities. We have to say that when the UDHR refers to human beings, it's actually referring to agents. And that is the natural interpretation, actually. Now, of course, a lot of people then say, oh, you mean, young children don't have rights. And we know perfectly that very young children don't have rights. And people in persistent vegetative states don't have rights. Okay? Well, there's a way that you can kind of say, well, they sort of do. Okay? And that is to say that when the UDHR talks about having rights equally, it does not mean having the same rights. It means being under the protection of the same principle for having rights equally. And I think we have to say the latter, otherwise there is a contradiction in the whole system. Because ICCPR and other human rights instruments, like instruments to do with conventions to do with people with mental disabilities, rights of children, etc., grant them rights. Okay, now what that has to mean, they can't possibly be equal in the sense of being the same rights. You mean a child's got a right to marry when it's 2 years old, for example, etc., etc., etc. And I'll try and sort of explain just how that pans out in a minute. It makes life a bit complicated. But anyway, what you have to say is something like this. Only humans able to do things for reasons, by which you mean act under the guidance of practical precepts, meaning human agents, really have human rights properly speaking. Children don't really, when they're very young. People in persistent vegetative states and so on don't. But, wait for it. This doesn't mean that agents don't owe duties to them. Okay, now agents can owe duties, if you like, in relation to non-agents, because of the relationship between the non-agents and agents. Okay, so if you treat a dog badly, maybe, and that dog is owned by an agent, the agent gets terribly upset. You could be impinging on the rights of the agent, therefore you have a duty not to harm the dog. That's vicarious. I'm not talking about that. Okay? I'm talking about having duties to children because of the properties that children have, even though they're not agents, or maybe not agents. And this is where it gets complicated, okay? And if you'd all read my book with Roger on human dignity and bioethics and biolaw, I wouldn't have to kind of even begin to try and say what's going on here. But the idea is it has to be to guard for agents having rights that you have to grant the duties. And it has to be not because of the protection of other agents vicariously, but because of somehow the relationship between a child, person in a persistent vegetative state. By a child, I mean a very, very young child. Okay. Children become agents fairly young. And the general basic idea is that you don't really know who an agent is. And let me just run through this very quickly. I don't actually know that there's any agent in the world other than myself. That's just a fact. In order to be an agent, you have to have, as it were, some kind of self-image. You have to have understanding. You have to be able to reason. You have to have, as it like, an inner mental state. I've got an inner mental state. I really do not know that any other being in the world does. What I do know is that lots of people, including all the people in this room, basically act as though they do, or behave as though they do. But I don't actually know. There's an assumption. There's an assumption there. It's a metaphysical assumption. Okay. So I can't possibly know. So if I assume you're all agents, I could be wrong. If I assume you're not agents, I could be wrong. And there's no way I can possibly know whether I'm right or not. Okay? But if human rights are inalienable, etc., and they, as it were, impose categorical duties, then I must not, the one thing I must not do, if it's at all possible for me not to do it, is I must not fail to grant an agent human rights. A human agent, human rights. If I assume you're not agents, and I'm wrong, I violate your human rights. If I assume that you, as it were, are an agent and you're not, I haven't violated anyone's human rights. So I have to treat all agents, or all beings that behave as though they are agents, as agents. Right? And I'm not thinking now about agents. I'm talking about apparent agents where I'm defending, respecting agency on the basis of human cognitive vulnerability within a kind of a context of possibility rather than actuality. It's all philosophically quite complicated. Now, the same kind of thing can happen in relation to dogs or very young children. They don't behave like agents, but that doesn't mean that they aren't. But there's a difference. Okay? If you behave like an agent, I can treat you like an agent. If you don't behave like an agent, I can't. But that doesn't mean that I can completely discount this particular fact. Okay? You might be agents, and you will display certain kinds of interests which, if you're an agent, you would have rights to. And so the argument kind of goes that you can generate duties of a certain strength simply to guard against the possibility that beings who appear not to be agents actually are. And then you can have duties towards them on that basis, not on a vicarious basis. And that's all very interesting if you're interested in animal rights and everything else and whatever. The second thing that we have to note here is that because may and ought imply can do and also able not to, all beings who have human rights must be vulnerable in that they do not necessarily act in accord with or achieve the goals set by their practical precepts. So being the property you need to possess to be, as it were, have human dignity is not merely to be an agent, it's to be a vulnerable agent. Okay, so what can violate human dignity? Well, first of all, I think we simply have to accept this. Because human rights are grounded in human dignity and are inalienable, any and only violation of a human right, which includes withholding of the human rights equally to all agents, can basically constitute a violation. Now, a lot of people will then say, so you're not making a distinction between human rights and human dignity. Okay, I mean, this connection is because it's a necessary and sufficient condition for having human rights, right? You have this connection between the two. Human dignity just refers to human rights. It's a redundant concept. You have people like John Harris saying it's a completely redundant concept. Well, no. The point is, we're talking, what human dignity is, it's this property. The function of human dignity as against human rights in a broader discourse is to focus you on the question, what is the property by virtue of which rights are possessed, if you like? And people disagree about that. Peter Singer would say it isn't being an agent. He'd say it's like it's being able to suffer pain and experience pleasure. And animals can do that, for example. That's what he would say. But I'm not interested in whether that's true or not at the moment. I think it's wrong, okay? But within the framework of the UDHR, that's not a tenable view. And we're not considering whether the UDHR exists, whether we should think that the UDHR is right or not. I'm talking simply about what the UDHR says is the reason, what human dignity consists of. And you can also violate human dignity the only other way, right, is if you act contrary to duties owed to beings with precautionary protection grounded in human rights, which is what I just went through with all the animals and that precautionary reasoning. But that's just a special application of that first idea that there's this biconditional relationship between human dignity and human rights. But of course, this tells you nothing unless you know more precisely what human dignity resides in, that you can identify what human rights there actually are as a result of all of this, and also for your specifications to be justified. So now I'm going to tell you basically that there is a supreme principle of human rights. There is a principle which has to be, as it were, respected equally when you are dealing with human beings. And that you do not have a consistent application of the UDHR unless that application is consistent with the principle I'm going to outline. Okay. Now, if we weren't talking about the UDHR and we were talking about human rights, okay, and we were asking questions about human dignity, what you would need to justify a principle, to identify what human dignity consists in, and so on, is you would need what I call a dialectically necessary principle, or what Alan Gewirth calls a dialectically necessary principle. This is exactly the same thing as what Kant would talk about when he says you have to establish a categorical imperative as a synthetic a priori principle, or by a transcendental deduction. A dialectically necessary principle is one that an agent must accept or else imply that the agent is incapable of acting or following any practical precept. In other words, it's what you must accept in order for you not to contradict, that it's intelligible for you to think of yourself as having any kind of practical precepts at all. For may and ought to make any sense to you. The idea is you've got to establish a principle by showing that agents have to accept this principle, or else deny their agents, and if they deny that they're agents, that means that they're claiming that it's unintelligible for them to have any practical precepts at all, which is a contradiction in terms. Now, this is very controversial, of course. The whole idea that you can establish a categorical imperative on a basis like this, and the idea of inalienable rights and all the rest of it, links directly to a categorical imperative. And you get, for example, Bernard Williams charges anyone who tries to establish a categorical impartial imperative, in other words, something which is categorically binding on agents, where agents have got to respect other agents as though they were themselves, etc., etc. That kind of idea you find in Gewerth, you also find it in Kant. He says Kant can show that there is such a principle, but it cannot apply to those like human agents who are affected by heteronymous incentives. You've got to sort of imagine you're an agent, a rational agent, and nothing more, and there's no such thing as a rational agent who's just a rational agent and nothing more. Agents are distinguished from each other, and part of their essential identity is the fact that they're distinguished from each other. And if you think of them as not being distinguished from each other, then you can establish this. But then this does not apply to real human agents. And what he says is that Gewerth can show that there's such a principle, but he can't show that it's impartial. In other words, he can show why I'm categorically bound to, shall we say, act in certain ways, but those ways do not require me to, as it were, respect you in the same way as I must respect myself. And his argument is presented in Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy, Chapter 4, 1985 book. But now this is the point, okay? We can simplify all of this because we're working within the framework of the UDHR 1948. Even if Williams is right, and he's wrong, and if you want to know why he's wrong, you can read my article in the Journal of Moral Philosophy 2013, etc. Okay? His dilemma is a false dilemma. It doesn't apply to positions that operate with the presumption of categorically required impartiality. And that's exactly what the UDHR does when it starts off with the idea that all human beings are equal in dignity and rights, and they have reason and conscience and ought to act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. I think that's more or less the exact language in the English translation. And of course, all human beings includes all human agents. And I've said something at any rate about some of the complexities about relating human beings to human agents here. Okay, so now we're going to start from what is perhaps the most controversial premise from a purely philosophical point of view, which is precisely this categorical impartiality assumption. We don't need to justify it if we're simply talking about what does the UDHR require. Okay? Anyway, now this is a really tricky bit, okay? Technical stuff. I'm afraid, sorry, I tend to do philosophy in this kind of way. I'm a very old-fashioned rationalist. I want to argue that it's dialectically necessary for any agent, call her Agnes if you like, I like to call her Agnes in the things that I'm writing about nowadays, to accept what I call the principle of hypothetical imperatives. And the principle says this: if doing something X or having something Y is necessary to achieve Agnes's purposes E, or to act in accordance with Agnes's practical precepts P, then Agnes ought to do X or act to secure Y, or give up E and P, and or P, right? And the point is, I'm saying that if you don't understand that, if you don't accept that, okay, then you don't understand what it is to act. And if you don't understand what it is to act, you don't understand what it is to be an agent. If you don't understand what it is to be an agent, you actually misunderstand what it is to be an agent. You imply that you're not an agent. If you don't, that principle, right, it's not a hypothetical imperative. Okay? It's not a hypothetical imperative. It's categorically binding. You can't, if you like, it's just, and if you say, well, why is it categorically binding? Well, it's categorically binding because you presuppose it. If you claim to have any practical precepts at all, or to be a being capable of having any practical precept. So if you don't accept this, you render it Agnes renders it unintelligible, right, for her to attribute any E or P to herself. Okay, that's why. Now, as vulnerable agents, and we have to be vulnerable agents, remember, there are generic conditions of agency. Kant refers to these things, he doesn't talk about them in this way. Again, this is a Gowerthian thing. A generic condition of agency is something you need in order to be able to pursue or achieve any possible purposes you might have. So in other words, if these things are interfered with or you don't have them, it interferes in at least some extent, either totally or to some extent, with your ability either to act at all, regardless of what purposes you're trying to pursue, etc., or to actually be guaranteed that you will act successfully. You'll be able to achieve these purposes. Now, if you add that to the principle of hypothetical imperatives, and you recognize that the principle of hypothetical imperatives is categorically binding, then you get Agnes categorically, regardless of Agnes's purposes or practical precepts, ought to act to defend her having these generic conditions of agency, unless she's willing to accept generic damage to her ability to act. So if you like, it's a rather funny sort of statement, but it says, Agnes ought to act to protect her life for the purpose of being able to act at all, okay, unless she's willing to accept that she won't be able to act at all as a result of not defending her life. Okay? It might sound completely empty. In fact, it's very, very far from empty. Now, the point is this. Anyone who grants Agnes any human right, whatever this might be, to something called it R, must grant all human agents human rights, their genetic conditions of agency, because human rights are possessed equally by all humans, and possession of their generic conditions of agency is necessary for them to exercise their rights, whatever these might be. If you grant a person a right to do something, and you're not prepared to grant them the necessary means to exercise that right, you have not sincerely granted them that right. That's very simple, just follows from what necessary means. So, acceptance, and this is because of the categorical impartiality built into the UDHR, acceptance of human rights per the UDHR requires acceptance of the principle, act in accord with the grant of a right to possess the generic conditions of agency to all human agents. But because all agents categorically ought to accept the principle of hypothetical imperatives, all human rights of agents must be interpreted under the will conception of rights. And this is where you get a disagreement, where Gowerth and Kant disagree with each other. Okay? So Kant says you can't commit suicide, you can't, as it were, act to interfere with your own life, unless to protect the lives of others. Once you recognize that the principle of hypothetical imperatives is, as it were, itself a categorical imperative, and there can only be one categorical imperative by the meaning of a categorical imperative, which Kant himself recognizes, then you have to, it turns the other way around. You can do anything to yourself as long as this does not interfere with the human rights of others. So if I want to commit suicide, as long as that's not going to interfere with the generic rights or the human rights of others, that's fine. So things like assisted suicide and so on should not be prohibited and all of that. And so you get this very fundamental, shall we say, reasoning to justify an answer in a very, very contentious debate. Okay? And so you can then have this principle, act to support the possession of all human agents, generic conditions of agency, unless they are willing to suffer generic damage to their ability to act. And then just some things very quickly here. Human dignity is not conferred by the capacity for autonomy, which is just a capacity for judgment alone. It's conferred by vulnerable autonomy, which is equivalent to a capacity for self-awareness as a finite being with a capacity to value. It can only be affirmed, as it were, attributed to those who are able to operate with the modality of possibility. In other words, it's conferred by having the capacity to doubt and, or more centrally, the capacity to hope and fear. That, I think, is what is really distinctive. It's distinctive, and it isn't always emphasized when people talk about it's the rational capacity. Well, what is important about the rational capacity in this context is it refers to the capacity to doubt, to ask questions, to dispute things, that's really what it's about. To realize that you can't know things, that things, you don't live in a world of actuality, you live in a world of imagination, you live in a world of creative, maybe, might be, what might happen? Am I going to die? When I die, what happens to me? Well, these kinds of questions, etc., etc., etc. And so, if you like, you could say it's related to the capacity to suffer or be happy, but only if you make a distinction between suffering and being able to experience pain or happiness and the ability to experience pleasure. So you can say, well, if you don't have a self-identity, you don't have reason, you don't have then you won't have any concerns about it. Pain is something that you feel, if you like. But suffering is not just something you can identify. Pain, it's something that you worry about, you care about. I remember once I dislocated my shoulder very badly. I was in a great deal of pain and I was suffering. All right, and they had to put me in a car and take me to a doctor a long way away, and they shoved morphine into me. First time I've ever had morphine, only time I've ever had morphine. And I can tell you right now, I continued to experience pain, but I did not care. It just dissociated me completely from the idea of suffering. Suffering just went out the window. But if somebody said to me, were you still in pain, I would say yes. I just didn't care, right? Okay. Now, human genome and human dignity. I've still got about 6 or 7 minutes here. Oh, I can use that, but if there's going to be time to discuss, we need, but I'll try. Okay. It says the human genome is the common heritage of, it says mankind, so humankind. And that's in the preamble. So human dignity is grounded in the human genome. But hold on a minute. What's this mean? Humans share up to about 99% of their genome with other creatures. So the human dignity as a common heritage of humankind cannot be violated by all manipulations of the human genome. It can only be violated by negative manipulations, in other words, those things which damage this capacity, of those components that enable human agents to be agents. Okay? Now, apart from the fact that we don't really know too well what these things are, there's no such thing as a gene for intelligence, etc. It's a combination of a whole lot of genes and interactions with the environment, and one gene to another gene is part of the environment of that gene. The human genome doesn't operate as a thing, right? As such, it's a whole series of things. And Ellen Wright Clayton said, the very accurate things about that sort of thing. So, violations by genomic manipulation, revisited, okay? Violation of human rights if the manipulation involves non-protection of the generic conditions of agency against their will, not justified by the need to protect equally or more important generic conditions of agency of other agents. You can put generic conditions of agency into a sort of a hierarchy. Some of them are necessary for you to be able to do anything at all. Others are only necessary for you to be able to act successfully. So if you are dead, you can't do anything at all, right? It just kills you. If somebody lies to you and you're presented with false information, it interferes with your ability to achieve your purposes, but it doesn't stop you trying. You can live to fight another day, as it were. Okay. If you are being tortured and you're in a sort of a catatonic state where all you can think of is suffering, you can't act at all. Okay. And various other degrees of pain will distract you from being able to achieve your purposes, but it won't stop you. Now, this is very complicated, and it's sort of something which I can't go into. Okay, it's very complicated. As to exactly how you would determine what is in a hierarchy, but the general idea of being able to put these things in some sort of hierarchy, you can do, and it's important. And of course, the other thing I said is manipulation that does not grant equal access to protection of the generic conditions of agency to all agents. And again, as I said, these determinations are complex because they don't just rest on the type of manipulation, whether it's somatic, whether it's germline, whether it's therapeutic, or it's non-therapeutic. It also depends, and again, Ellen Wright-Clayton was hinting at this, it also depends on the social and broader environmental context in which the manipulations take place, which can affect the conditions of access and the effects of the manipulations. And again, because it is so specific, it's very difficult to say anything other than general things about this. You have to kind of understand the general principles and logic here, and then look at the situations and look at the effects that they actually have and so on, in order to be able to say more specific things about this. But okay, we now want to come back to this question about what about those provisions of the Universal Declaration on the Human Genome and Human Rights and the Oviedo Convention. Well, I think they're mostly defensible, but they should be given a positive edge. We should be talking here about positive rights and negative rights. It's not just that people have a right not to be killed. There also is, right, because the rights are to these needs. There's a right to, shall we say, be assisted in defending your life when you're unable to do so by your own unaided efforts, and this is not going to cause disproportionate, shall we say, problems for the generic conditions of agency of those who are going to, as it were, assist you, provided that you want it. So positive rights as well as negative rights, welfare rights, if you like. There's no sort of right-wing conservative American libertarianism view of rights allowed here. Thank you very much. Okay. So hang on, we're not finished yet. But I think something like a blanket prohibition of cloning, right, while there are reasons for prohibiting it, has no basis in human dignity or human rights, because there's no intrinsic connection here to a generic need. It was by its nature. It's not that a prohibition of cloning cannot be justified because to allow cloning would affect human rights and human dignity. The point is, it's not intrinsic. It's not in the nature of cloning as such. Cloning will only have that effect in certain circumstances, when it will be used for certain purposes, for example. When using it for certain purposes will interfere with, which will not necessarily happen. It's not in the nature of the thing itself. And I think it's quite clear that the prohibition of therapeutic germline therapy is completely indefensible. And I do want to note, because I kind of drew attention to this right at the beginning, there's a flat contradiction between Article 12 of the Universal Declaration on the Human Genome and Human Rights. Okay, it says you cannot deny treatments that will be beneficial to the individual and the human race generally. Well, germline gene therapy things can definitely be that. Okay? And not to do them in a germline way will definitely be unequal. Right? Will not give it to all of them. You're going to be much more easily give it to all of them if you go through a germline route than another. So, so when you get the Article 12 of the Oviedo Convention, bye-bye. Now I do, as I say, my Spanish is non-existent, but I did go and sit in on a presentation which was given by somebody who was talking about Article 12 of the Oviedo Convention, and the general theme was, is it time to revise this? And I'm giving you a quite unequivocal answer. It has no place in a human rights convention. Right? But then just simply some suggestions. And now you're going to see exactly where, in a sense, from a political point of view, I'm coming from. The most serious and difficult to regulate and prevent violations involve unequal and discriminatory access to benefits. Right? Sound objections to manipulations like cloning, germline therapy, and enhancements lie in this concern and the possible intentions behind the manipulations, not in the manipulations themselves. But now I don't, okay? And now the Americans and Donald Trump are after me. To fully implement the principle of generic consistency, which is in effect, Coert's principle, it is this principle I've been talking about, which is needed to honor the UDHR, requires a different social system from that which characterizes any social system currently operating in the world, or indeed any social system that has ever yet operated in the world. And I make no secret of the fact, because it's actually obvious, this principle is equivalent to the Marxist slogan, from each according to their ability and to each according to their need. Now, that doesn't mean I'm a Marxist, right? Because there's a hell of a lot more to Marxism than that slogan, which is taken from the Gotha program. Marx has a whole kind of theory about how history is supposed to operate, and there are forces within, as it were, history, etc., which will inevitably bring certain things about, etc., etc. And there's no commitment. I'm not, shall we say, committing myself to anything in that. But I think that that Marxist slogan is exactly what human rights, shall we say, in the UDHR presupposes. But how to move towards a society that enables this to be actualized is altogether a different matter. And I wouldn't even pretend I could address that properly if you gave me another 2 hours. But I certainly cannot do it now. Thank you.
Okay, ¿me escuchan? ¿Sí? Well, thank you very much, Derek, for your interesting talk. I'm going to explain a little bit in Spanish to the audience, all right? Thanks so much. I won't be able to check what you Just a couple of minutes. Bueno, si ayuda un poco, les voy a explicar un poquito de lo que dijo Derek. Para los que pueden haber entendido poco o menos que poco. De lo que estaba el tema central de Derek, que es cuándo y cómo la manipulación del genoma humano puede violar la dignidad humana y los derechos humanos. Entonces, él comienza analizando algunas prohibiciones de la UNESCO relacionadas precisamente con ciertas prácticas vinculadas al genoma humano y que estarían basadas fundamentalmente en los derechos humanos y la dignidad. Resalta que incluso las digamos, manipulaciones que pueden ser beneficiosas están prohibidas y cualquier tipo de manipulación genética, sea o no terapéutica. Algunos tópicos que él aborda se pregunta qué es la dignidad humana, si esta puede ser violada, se pregunta por la relación entre el genoma humano y la dignidad y cuál sería específicamente esa relación y cuáles manipulaciones específicamente podrían representar violaciones, ¿cierto?, de la dignidad humana y los derechos humanos. La hipótesis es fundamentalmente que la dignidad es el fundamento de los derechos humanos, o sea, él dice que es la ratio essendi, ¿cierto?, de los derechos humanos. La dignidad, dice él, es como la razón ontológica por la cual los seres humanos tienen derechos humanos. Después comienza a discutir cuáles seres humanos poseen derechos humanos y se introduce un poco en el tema de qué es una agencia moral, ¿cierto?, y quiénes son agentes morales. La agencia moral, Derek la relaciona con la capacidad, fundamentalmente con ciertas capacidades, ¿cierto? Y dice, bueno, los derechos en general pueden existir en virtud de esas capacidades, dice, ¿cierto? Es una cuestión como de grado, ya que el tener esas capacidades, ¿cierto?, de tener derechos también determina de alguna manera la capacidad de cumplir deberes. Hay para Derek una cierta reciprocidad entre derechos y deberes, o sea, alguien que no es capaz de cumplir deberes, evidentemente no necesariamente debiera ser titulado con derechos, dice él. Sí, nosotros, dice, tenemos, los que somos agencias morales, los que sí podemos cumplir deberes, tenemos deberes con aquellos que no son agentes, dice él, ¿cierto? O sea, esto no significa que no se va a respetar a otro ser humano que a lo mejor no tenga la capacidad de cumplir deberes, ¿cierto? Como un bebé anencefálico, por ejemplo. Pero evidentemente nosotros tenemos cierta obligación con ellos, habría que revisar esos límites, pero no puede significar que ellos tengan derechos con el mismo grado de intensidad de alguien que sí es agente moral. Esboza una crítica a Peter Singer, esta que nos quedó claro que, que evidentemente no está de acuerdo con Peter Singer. Dice que no solamente la capacidad de sentir, sufrir o de mostrar intereses bastaría, digamos, para convertirse en un agente, como sí lo afirma Peter Singer, ¿cierto? Después se pregunta, ¿dónde residiría la dignidad humana? ¿cierto? Y dice, bueno, para justificar los derechos humanos necesitamos, dice, un principio dialécticamente necesario. ¿Qué significa esto? Aquí se mete en un tema bien filosófico, ¿no? Y se mete con Kant, imperativos categóricos, hipotéticos, etc. Dice, bueno, un principio dialécticamente necesario sería aquel que todos los agentes podrían aceptar como condición y que sea lo suficientemente inteligible para que ellos se vean a sí mismos también como agentes, se reconozcan a sí mismos como agentes morales, ¿cierto? O se piensen a sí mismos como agentes morales. Sin embargo, evidentemente, él se hace cargo de ciertas críticas, como la de Bernard Williams, decía ese principio dialécticamente necesario sería imparcial o no, llevado a la práctica, ¿cierto? ¿Qué argumentos se esgrime? Solamente voy a hacer un énfasis en un par que son importantes. Se meten temas de imperativos hipotéticos que finalmente no resultaría inteligible para agencias morales, ¿cierto? Un principio hipotético o imperativo hipotético, lo explico brevemente, es un imperativo moral, pero que, digamos, se despliega en función de condiciones. O sea, yo voy a cumplir, por ejemplo, esta obligación moral solo porque me reporta buenas consecuencias, ¿cierto? O sea, lo voy a hacer porque busco una consecuencia deseada. Eso es hipotético. Categórico es cuando uno cumple con el deber independientemente de las consecuencias. Entonces, él dice, el cumplir o moverse a partir de imperativos hipotéticos sería ininteligible para un agente moral, ¿cierto? Debería vincularse más a lo categórico. Y después esboza un concepto que es como más o menos central, en lo que él señala, que es un concepto que se llama como condiciones genéricas de agencia, ¿cierto? Que está vinculado precisamente a este tema de los imperativos categóricos. Discute el tema del genoma humano, dice que la dignidad humana está fundada en el genoma humano, no puede ser violada por cualquier manipulación, solo por aquellas que precisamente no protegen esas condiciones genéricas de agencia moral y por aquellas manipulaciones que no garantizan igual acceso a la protección de esas condiciones genéricas. Finalmente señala que el estado de cosas, el estado del arte, ¿cierto?, de la regulación en el fondo es contradictorio, hay prohibiciones vacías, ¿cierto?, vale decir sin contenido, o sea, no basadas en la dignidad humana, ¿de acuerdo a él? Dignidad humana, y da ejemplos de la clonación, ¿cierto?, de la terapia germinal, que pudiendo haber razones para que estén prohibidas, esas razones que se han dado no están basadas precisamente ni en la doctrina de los derechos humanos, ni tampoco en la dignidad humana, al menos como la concibe él, ¿cierto? Al no estar vinculada con sus argumentos, serían implausibles, ya que los contenidos de los derechos humanos, de acuerdo a Derek, provienen precisamente de esas condiciones genéricas de los humanos. Como sugerencia, bueno, él plantea, digamos, que hay problemas importantes como el acceso desigual a los beneficios en estos aspectos y que se requeriría de una plataforma social distinta u otro modelo distinto al actual para establecer este tipo de regulaciones. Y termina con una cita de Marx, que todos ustedes, me imagino, ya conocen, que no la voy a repetir. Eso es más o menos lo que habló, así, y no sé si alguien tiene alguna pregunta. Sí, Gaby. Ah, ya. Questions. Gracias. Ok, bueno, tenemos 3 preguntas, entonces. Okay, this is very interesting. What definition of human dignity could you offer outside the framework of the United Nations Human Rights Declaration?
Okay, if you, in fact, exactly the same one, right? But in order to do that, and in order to justify it, I would have to, as it were, rely on, if you like, the dialectically necessary argument for the categorical imperative being valid. Now, if you want to look at shall we say, Gewirth's argument, right, and it runs parallel to Kant's argument in a number of ways, the argument begins by trying to say that you have to accept that you are an end in it yourself, so it's a subjective principle. Both Kant and Gewirth would argue that on the basis of, well, in Gewirth's case, the principle of hypothetical imperatives being a dialectically necessary principle, And then you combine this with the idea that there are generic conditions of agency, and then you get this thing, I ought to defend my generic conditions of agency. That's relatively uncontroversial, okay? If there's anything controversial about it, you get some people saying to show that something's dialectically necessary doesn't actually give me a reason to obey it. In other words, maybe I don't care that I contradict myself, okay? And I think they completely misunderstand the point. I mean, the first thing that they're actually trying to do is they're trying to treat a categorical imperative as something that makes you do something. Right? Now, if you actually think about an imperative, the whole point about an imperative when it says that you ought to do something presupposes that you are both able to do it and able not to do it. If you're necessarily going to do it or necessarily not going to do it, it makes absolutely no sense to say that you ought to do it. Okay? So to try and somehow analyze the concept of an ought in a Humean internalistic way, where the only thing that can give you reasons to act are your chosen purposes and the means towards them, in other words, hypothetical imperatives, just makes complete nonsense from the start, rules out the whole notion of ought. Now, the whole point about a dialectically necessary justification is it doesn't try to give you that sort of reason. It says you presuppose that dialectically necessary considerations give you reasons to act in a categorically binding way in order for it to be even intelligible for you to talk about hypothetical imperatives. Because if you are, if you, as it were, deny that you are an agent, you deny that you are capable of being bound by a hypothetical imperative. Because a hypothetical imperative is still a practical precept. So it's a question of intelligibility. And it really is, you know, let's just grow up, I want to say to these people. Ought is a child of reason. For you to ask why a dialectically necessary commitment necessarily gives me a reason to act is to ask, why is it rational for me to be rational? Right? It makes no sense. And this is partly what Kant means when he says rational nature is an end in itself. Okay? And that rational nature being an end in itself is the ground of the categorical imperative, is what he actually tells us. Now, the point is, you get to the first stage of Gowerth's argument, fine. But now Gowerth wants to say that this is equivalent to me claiming rights for myself, and that because it's dialectically necessary, I've got to grant these rights to other agents as well. Now, if we had time, I would present what I think is a completely conclusive sequence of arguments to show that that's in fact true. Most people don't believe it's true because they misinterpret the argument. They try and treat dialectical necessity so it was some kind of Hobbesian self-interest argument, that it's in my interest to grant you these things. It isn't that argument at all. Okay? That's a complete misinterpretation of Gowerth. Gowerth is like Kant, okay, in that sense. It's all about agential self-understanding, dialectical necessity, and so on. But the point here simply is, if you get this far, all of this still only applies to agents. So insofar as you think that dignity is something which confers rights, and rights are related to duties, right? You have to accept this conception, the conception of agency which is contained within the UDHR. It's the equality bit which is now added, if you like, by, and of course it's not just the UDHR. Anybody who upholds a principle to the effect that says all human beings have got to be treated with equal concern and respect or something is going to be in exactly the same boat.
That's it?
Yeah, I could go on, but hold on, you know, I mean.
Evidentemente, pero así, resumiéndola, está vinculada con el imperativo categórico, la dignidad también, en el sentido de que la dignidad humana está vinculada a la capacidad de cumplir deberes, de aceptar un principio dialécticamente necesario, vale decir, cumplir imperativos categóricos, obligaciones categóricas incondicionadas, de ser racional fundamentalmente, actuar sin contradicción, ser capaz de cumplir y hacer en términos generales, en este sentido, la dignidad humana supone la capacidad y habilidad de ser una agencia moral. Es un concepto evidentemente controversial de Derek, pero evidentemente él vincula e insiste en que tiene que estar vinculada y relacionada con capacidades y habilidades. Perdón, con capacidades y habilidades. This question is coming from Dr. Sergio Romeo. Can the mitochondrial DNA technique be considered a genetic manipulation in a strict sense? If so, does it violate human dignity and human rights?
I can't possibly see why it necessarily should. I'm saying any manipulation, right, in the way in which it's used and the intentions for which it's used could be a violation of human rights. And if it's a violation of human rights, then it's a violation of human dignity. I find it very difficult to see why this is necessarily true. In other words, why you can make the judgment which says to do this, right, would violate human dignity and human rights. Right? How would it, let's put it this way. If you're going to benefit certain people by doing this and not benefit other people by doing it, then there's a certain kind of problem. If this is necessary somehow to, and it is to some extent. I mean, the effect of, the reason why I have these mitochondrial, shall we say, the use of a mitochondria from somebody else is because of the effect it has on, shall we say, energy processes and so on of the child. The child might survive. The child will, however, will be severely debilitated and so on. You are now thinking of having a child that will not have this serious debilitation. And these debilitations can be, will definitely be in a sense, will definitely be violations in relation to depriving or interfering with the generic conditions of agency of the child. So, in a sense, if you can give this to the child, either don't have the child, but there's no imperative that says you've got to have children as such. But the point is, if you're going to have children, you have a duty to make sure you do what you can to make that they will, as it were, in the sort of the minimal sense which is really required to be functioning agents, that they have it. And if you have the mitochondrial, shall we say, defects in the mitochondrial DNA, or RNA and so on, then you will not, right, have a child that way. So why are you creating a child with this particular kind, these particular defects? Don't. If you are, and this is a way that you can do it, what's the problem? Okay? Now, of course, there are other contexts here about how you get it, who you get it from, who has it available to them, and so on, which you have to consider on a case-by-case basis, more or less. But you can't say that mitochondrial manipulations are going to violate. The other point about this is it genetic? Well, it again depends on what you call the human genome. You can talk about an individual's genome, and you can talk about the human genome. And I suppose if you talk about the human genome, you're talking about that part of the genome which human beings actually happen to have that somehow makes them human, right? Otherwise, when you talk about, we should not be manipulating the genome of any animal because we, or plant because we share, 50% or something about, with. And well, why is mitochondrial DNA not part of an individual's actual genetic makeup and how the genome as a whole functions? There are no single, genes which operate outside of an environment. I'll give you an analogy, okay? It's slightly off the point, but I think it's actually very instructive. A lot of geneticists don't understand what things like heritability and so on actually mean. There's a thing which goes around, and when people change the value depending upon who they are, I thought it was 80%, right? 80% of intelligence is supposed to be, meaning IQ, which is not the same thing as intelligence, is supposed to be heritable. And I heard some more left-wing people sort of say, no, it's only 50%. Well, forget about what it is, 50% or 80%, okay? What does it mean to say 80% of intelligence is heritable? Okay? It doesn't mean that 80% of your intelligence is determined by your genes. Definitely doesn't mean that. Okay? What it means is that in a particular population in which this was measured, 80% of the variation in IQ was due to the variation in the genome of the individuals in that population. That's what it means. And what that means is that this heritability thing will alter according to the degree to which intelligence is environmentally, shall we say, affected. The model to think of is to think of the phenotype as the area of a rectangle. Think of the genotype as its side and think of the environment as its length. And I come along to you and I say, what percentage of the area of the triangle is due to its length? Is there only one answer you can give? If there wasn't a length, there wouldn't be a rectangle. It's the only answer you can give. You might want to say 100%, but you'd have to say exactly the same thing when the question is directed at the width. Okay? And now you realize that, in fact, when you have a genome and you have one particular gene, other genes are environment for the first gene. And that you only get a phenotype when all of these things are interacting in a particular kind of way. So the mitochondria, right, are part of what you might call this thing. And when you're talking about the human genome affecting something, you cannot divorce it from thinking about the context in which all of this is happening. And there's no simple way of shortcutting this. Scientists very often shortcut it because they can sell it to people who are going to fund their research. We are geneticists. We can show that 80% of this thing is due to genetics, therefore you must give us the money. Right? And don't give it to social scientists who might affect the political situation and all the rest of it. It's got nothing to do with it, okay? Genetics is the solution. So if you like, scientists can be guilty of old facts, right? It's not that they are, or that science is, but scientists definitely can be guilty of manipulating things that actually happen.
It's okay, Sergio. Bueno, tenemos... bueno, lo que dijo es sí y no, en el fondo. O sea, no se casa mucho con el término estricto sentido, digamos, ¿cierto? Y finalmente sí, dice que toda práctica genética, incluso la mitocondrial, puede ser evidentemente perjudicial, pero no necesariamente. Y da ejemplos, por ejemplo, de niños genéticamente, por ejemplo, modificados para tener capacidades diferentes, y dice, ¿por qué eso podría ser malo, digamos, si no daña a nadie, etcétera? Entonces la respuesta es que sí y no, y que no necesariamente. Okay, only 2 more questions and very short answers, please. Okay. Is dignity a cultural concept or a natural fact?
Dignity is that which gives you moral worth. And in the sense that it's meant to be tied to the idea of rights, and moral worth means things like rights and so on, it cannot be a cultural construct. And look, a view can be a cultural construct. So views on human dignity can vary from one culture to the next, if you like, just as they can vary from one philosopher to the next as to what they think, right? I'm basically trying to say to you, you can only make a sense of talking about dignity if dignity is supposed to be something in relation to normativity, if you have this particular conception of it. Any other kind of conception of it makes no sense.
Dice que en general la dignidad humana es más bien una condición ontológica y que más bien las visiones sobre la dignidad humana podrían ser convenciones o constructos sociales, ¿cierto? Eso fundamentalmente. And we have 2 more questions, but we'll take only one. Can categorical imperatives be placed in some kind of hierarchy?
There's only one categorical imperative and can only be one categorical imperative.
No varios imperativos categóricos. Hay formulaciones de un solo imperativo categórico. Por lo tanto, no puede haber jerarquía si hay uno solo. Ok. Le voy a entregar los certificados. Thank you very much for everything, Derek. Let me give you a couple of certificates for your participation in our seminar, and especially for your membership. Membership certificate, Mexico City, August 31st, 2017. I hereby certify that today, in the framework of the Third International Seminar of Biolaw and Human Rights, Dr. Derek Bielefeld from Durham University, United Kingdom, has joined the International Network of Biolaw as honorary member.